So, welcome everybody. As I mentioned, this is the monthly CSTN webinar for the month of, what month are we in? October. Debwewin, which is an Ojibwe word meaning truth. So, understanding the systemic roots of Indigenous homelessness. My name is Grant Martin. I am with the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network and happy to facilitate today's webinar. So I'd like to also start by acknowledging that where I'm situated, I'm on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Lenape, and Neutral Attawandaron peoples. I want to honor and respect the history, the languages, the culture of the diverse Indigenous people that call this territory home, and I'm grateful to do all things related to living, working, and playing on this land. But I also want to acknowledge too that CSTN is a national network with reaches across the country. So from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. And I try to subscribe to land acknowledgements by personally stating what I can do as a treaty person. I encourage others to seek learning and discourse about Indigenous communities. And those that are learning, please share and please ensure that what we're sharing is truth. So I really try to aim to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into my professional practice when appropriate and try to approach it with cultural humility. A few housekeeping items before we get started. One is I really want to encourage folks to mute your computer, although I think it's automatically muted for you. That just keeps down the background noise and things like that so that it minimizes any kind of disruption for our presenters and for the attendees listening. The other is that, yes, attendees can ask questions at any time. What I encourage you to do, as previously mentioned, is to put it in the Q&A box. Please don't put it in the chat box because that's a little bit more difficult to monitor. So please put your questions in the Q&A. We do have dedicated time at the end of the session for the last 20, 30 minutes to take questions from the audience, and I'll be referencing those when the time comes. A common question that's often asked is, will the webinar and the slides be posted somewhere or available after today's session? The answer is yes. Typically following our webinar about a week or so after, I will send out to everyone that registered for today's session. I'll send out an email that contains the link to the recording, as well as any kind of supporting documents and resources that were shared throughout the session. But just so you know too, if ever you weren't registered for something, but you want to find archived recordings, you can go to transformshelter.ca. Under the webinar tab, you'll see all the previous webinars hosted there. Our session is 90 minutes with approximately the first 60 minutes dedicated to our speakers, and then the last 20 or 30 minutes for Q&A. And I really want to make sure that we get folks out on time because I know that there's still other work that you need to be doing outside of here. So I appreciate the time that you took to join us today and learn together. And one final thing is that today's session is being recorded. So I would just say, if there's any concerns about that, just make sure your camera's off and do what you need to do to be anonymous in the room if you don't want to be included in the recording. So for those of you that may be newer to CSTN, we are a growing network of shelter leaders and organizations across the country who share the mission that is really a simple one, but powerful. We want to connect and support shelters that are committed to becoming housing focused and to being engines for ending homelessness. So we're building a national movement that helps shelters do this work more intentionally through learning, peer connection, shared advocacy. And at its heart, really, CSTN is about equipping shelters to help people move forward faster with dignity and housing at the center of everything that we do. So how does CSTN actually support shelters doing this work? First, through things like what we're doing today, our webinars and learning sessions, many of which are led by shelters who are already on this journey of becoming more housing focused. Second, we are offering a self-assessment tool that was developed by OrgCode that you can help you see where your organization is at in becoming housing focused and identify some potential areas of growth. And third, we're creating more opportunities for peer learning and sharing. So today's session is just one example, but we know that because we know that kind of like the best ideas come from the field. If you're going to the national conference in Montreal next week, please look for us in the program. We'll also be hosting a World Cafe Inspired and Ask Me Anything session that really kind of brings shelter leaders from across the country together. You'll see a QR code on the screen there. That's for you to be able to pull out your camera on your phone and scan, and it can bring you to a registration link that allows you to register as a CSTN member. Membership is completely free, and we invite everyone to be a part of this community. So scan away if you'd like, and you decide the level of participation. Some folks are really passive in their membership in the sense that they attend maybe things like webinars and other learning sessions, while others are perhaps a bit more active and participate in things like training and development and contribute to things like our contribute to things like speaking at our webinars or help with advocacy. So you get to choose your own adventure when you become a member. So if you're wondering also too, maybe where to find some tools that can help support you in this transformation, you can always go to our website, which is transformshelter.ca, and you'll see that there's a resources tab. And that has tons and tons of resources from both Canadian and American communities that have shared stuff that they've developed so that as you're making these changes at your shelter, don't feel like you have to create everything from scratch. That can be kind of overwhelming. So you can look at what's already been created by others, by your peers, and either adopt or make adaptations to it as a jumping off point. And it goes from everything from like, maybe tools around diversion, prevention, rapid resolution, to things like how to accommodate pets or amnesty tote programs and things like that. So check that out if you'd like. And then also, as I mentioned previously, all the webinars are archived on the website as well. And so a reminder that today's session is part one of a two-part webinar series titled Debwewin, Pathways to Culturally Safe Shelter Practices. Debwewin is Ojibwe meaning life in the fullest sense, well-being, harmony, and balance. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve with everybody that we support who's experiencing homelessness. Joining us to lead these sessions starting today, and again, the second one in November, are Cassandra Harris and Bradley Stone from Giwetashkad program at Atlohsa Family Healing Services. So today's session, the first part is Debwewin, meaning truth. We're going to explore together how Indigenous homelessness is not simply a housing issue. It is the result of generations of systemic displacement, cultural erasure, and discriminatory policies. And so this session is really going to examine the historical and current colonial systems that shape Indigenous experiences of homelessness with a focus on how these factors influence access to and experiences within our emergency shelters. In November, which is the second session, um, we've titled it Mana Giwetashkad, meaning respect, honor, compassion. We're going to build off the learnings from our first session today and learn some practical ways to integrate culturally safe, respectful, and effective supports for Indigenous shelter guests. So if you plan to attend, we hope that you'll gain tools for embedding Indigenous cultural practices, building strong community partnerships, and aligning shelter operations with reconciliation frameworks. So this is a bit of our outline for today. I'm sorry, I put the wrong title into that slide. It's not regulate, rehouse. That was last month. Every month there's an error somewhere on my slides. At least I'm consistent with my mistakes. Today is actually Debwewin. But yes, as I mentioned previously with Cassandra and Bradley. So our speakers today, Cassandra is a settler of predominantly Irish heritage with some French, German, and English ancestry also sprinkled in. She has spent over 10 years building relationships and working for various Indigenous-led First Nations organizations in southwestern Ontario. She grew up in the city of Sarnia, close to the waters of Lake Huron and the St. Clair River, and moved to London in 2005 to attend university. She started at Atlohsa in 2021 as a community care worker at Wigwamanon Shelter and moved into a cultural safety training role in 2022. Today, she is the knowledge exchange coordinator of Giwetashkad, which is a training program of Atlohsa within their Indigenous homelessness team. And everything that Cassandra shares in her work is what she has learned through building relationships and spending time with Indigenous folks. She walks through the world with a ton of privilege, deep gratitude, and a big mushy heart, praying and finding ways to put them to good use. Also joining us is Bradley Stone. Brad is a Dakota and Plains Cree ancestry from Whitecap Dakota First Nation and Mosquito Grizzly Bears Head Lean Man First Nation in Saskatchewan. He is a proud father of 2 daughters who help him understand the beautiful gift that being a father is. Basketball is a strong passion of his, as is 90s hip hop, which you may or may not hear him quoting from time to time. In fact, in my first meeting with Brad, he quoted 90s hip hop back to me. Really appreciated that. And so he's reconnecting to Indigenous culture and spirituality. That's really helped him in his identity and his healing journey and recovery. And he's worked in various capacities as a helper, from outreach to housing, to case management, to cultural coordinator, youth engagement, to recreation coordinator. Combined with his recent education endeavors, obtaining a social service worker diploma and mental health and addictions diploma through First Nations Technical Institute, this has provided Brad with a wide array of skills, understandings, and life experiences to continue this work as a helper in a good way. In his journey, he remains thankful and has learned to practice 4 things for balance and self-care: to pray, to laugh, to cry, and to share. And the little that I know about Brad, he definitely likes to laugh. I've noticed that. So with that, I am going to pass the mic over to our speakers today, Cassandra and Bradley. And I will just want to thank you for joining us today. And I'll stop sharing my screen so you can take over. Welcome.
All right. Thanks. I'm just going to make sure that you can see this. Okay. Can you see my screen now? The
We can see it.
presentation?
Beautiful.
All right. Great.
Perfect. Well, Padamia, which is thank you in my Dakota language. Miigwech is an Anishinaabe word for thank you. Thank you, Grant, and thank you for the Shelter Transformation Network for the opportunity to be here. It's important for me to take a moment to introduce myself. Haumatakiapi, Wamadihi Hadeska Amakiapiro, Wapahaska Hechuate, Mosquito Ochimia, Wapita Tanka Wakantanka, Ampeti. What I said in my Dakota language is my spirit name is Brown Spot Eagle. I come from Whitecap Dakota First Nation and Mosquito Grizzly Bears Head Lean Man First Nation. And I said, thank you very much, Creator, and it's a good day. To all of you joining the call today, hello. Thank you for joining us here to deepen your understanding of Indigenous homelessness. As you can imagine, this is a very complex topic, and the short time we have together does not fully do it justice. Me and Cass were going over this. We're like, how can we cram like 500 years of history in a 40-minute presentation and help people understand like where we're coming from? We'll do our best, and we hope you can take this information as a foundation to build upon. Before we get right into it, let me share a little bit about our daily work. So as you can see here, these pictures of the beautiful work that we do. Atlohsa Family Healing Services is an Indigenous nonprofit organization that provides a range of healing and wellness services for the whole family, including women, men, children, and youth. We understand that the social inequalities that Indigenous peoples face are the direct result of settler colonization. Therefore, our services aim to reconnect people with culture and a positive Indigenous identity, using cultural interventions as the basis of healing and wellness. Some of the services include Giwetashkad, which is our Indigenous mental health care, Okatanage, which is our anti-human trafficking team. We have elder support, our Jawana Women's Shelter. We have a Healing Lodge team. We have Giwetashkad Indigenous Homelessness team, where we come from, offering housing supports and street outreach. And we have our Wigwamanon Shelter and many more that you can learn on our website. Cass and I are joining you today from the Giwetashkad Training Series program, which is part of our Giwetashkad Indigenous Homelessness team. All the work Atlohsa offers, including our training and education, is Indigenous-led, grounded in the lived and living experience of Indigenous peoples, and informed through Indigenous-led community-based research. Giwetashkad is a part of Atlohsa's Giwetashkad strategic plan to address and alleviate Indigenous homelessness in the London region. This is a Anishinaabe word meaning returning to sit in a circle. For many of us as Indigenous people, the circle is part of our worldview and approach to the way we do things. When we do our Module 1 and Module 2 work in person, we physically all sit in a circle. We always make sure we have a smudge to start our meetings off. That's what you were seeing earlier, all the smoke rising, the place wasn't on fire. I had a good smudge before I started here. And when we sit in a circle, we're all equal. You know, we're all doing this work together, and we come from a place of love and a place of kinship. So just imagine that we're all sitting in a virtual circle here across Turtle Island, and wherever it is you're coming from. It's good to virtually meet all of you. Our mandate is up on the screen here, and we build capacity for service providers to provide more effective, culturally safe care for Indigenous peoples. We have a couple of training modules that we offer to service providers in our region, and we host community fires and larger education events focused on Indigenous harm reduction, building relationships, and supporting frontline workers. We're happy to be here for the first of 2 sessions of Debwewin Pathways to Culturally Safe Shelter Practices. Today, we are setting a foundation and context to understand Indigenous homelessness as a direct result of generations of systemic displacement, cultural erasure, and discriminatory practices through the system of settler colonization, as well as the ways colonialism continues to shape Indigenous experiences of homelessness. This session is closely modeled after our training Module 1, which is definition of Indigenous homelessness, and will cover a lot of information. And together we will review the definition of Indigenous homelessness, explore Indigenous concepts of home and belonging, examine the intention, policies, and power dynamics of settler colonialism in Canada, and apply the 12 dimensions of Indigenous homelessness. Let's start off by taking a look at the definition of Indigenous homelessness from Jesse Thistle. Jesse is a Métis man with lived experience of homelessness. He lived on the streets of Ottawa for 10 years before he went into recovery and treatment, found stable housing, got married, and is now pursuing his PhD. Some of you may have read his awesome book called From the Ashes. Jesse is an internationally renowned Indigenous scholar and was hired by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness to lead research all across Canada. He spoke with hundreds of Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness and heard their stories. This definition up on the slide is what came out of his research. Whereas the common definition, Canadian definition and understanding of homelessness focus simply on a lack of physical place to live, Jesse's research shows that the Indigenous homelessness is much more complex. Rather, Indigenous homelessness is defined as individuals, families, and communities isolated from their relationships to a number of things: land, water, animals, plants, family, extended family, kin, and even our native languages, cultures, and Indigenous identities. Importantly, Indigenous peoples experiencing these kinds of homelessness cannot culturally, spiritually, emotionally, or physically reconnect with their indigeneity or lost relationships. Just take a moment to think about that. There are hundreds of diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis cultures and communities across what is now called Canada. Each nation has distinct languages, teachings, and ceremonies. However, one thing that we have in common is that, generally speaking, as Indigenous peoples, we believe that everything in creation is alive and interrelated, that we exist in relationship with the trees, the bugs, the animals, fish, the water, etc. This whole network of relationships is often referred to as all our relations. This definition of homelessness offers a much broader and deeper understanding of home as being connected to a sense of interrelatedness or belonging, being connected to all our relations. You can also see that the experience of Indigenous homelessness is not solely dependent on being housed, but is much, much bigger than that.
Awesome. So as we are exploring Debwewin or truth today, and we might be focusing a bit deeper on the painful truths and impacts of colonization, we also wanted to take a minute so that we are also keeping in mind the truth about Indigenous peoples. So that Indigenous folks are extremely, extremely awesome, beautiful, educated, connected peoples. Prior to European contact, and still today, of course, Indigenous communities have always been self-determining and self-governing nations, having really complex forms of governance, decision-making, politics, laws, and justice, Indigenous ways of educating and learning, and very vast economies and land bases. So Indigenous people are dignified, loving, sophisticated, absolutely brilliant human beings, brilliant people. Some might say they are the deadliest humans on the planet. But of course, today, the social disadvantages Indigenous people experience are the direct result of actions by the Crown and later Canada through the system of settler colonization. So homelessness is just one of the outcomes of settler colonization that Indigenous peoples continue to face today. Got some awesome photos here from one of our colleagues who is an amazing Anishinaabe photographer. So thanks to Jack for sharing some of his work with us. You can see some of the beauty here. Wanted to point out the Sanuk designer and share that we've got a lot of diversity here too, with Cree, Métis, and Anishinaabe people also represented. Okay, so understanding Indigenous homelessness actually requires a really thorough understanding of settler colonialism. So we have to understand colonization and its ongoing impacts on Indigenous individuals, families, and communities. There does seem to be this kind of common myth or tendency amongst non-Indigenous service providers that if we learn about Indigenous culture, that we will be able to provide equitable and culturally safe care. But this view is a little inaccurate and can be harmful. Of course, it's important to learn or build your cultural awareness, but at the same time, you have to remember there, first of all, is not just one single Indigenous culture, right? There are over 630 First Nations and Canadian occupied territories, not including Métis or diverse Inuit cultures. But even more importantly, Indigenous peoples are not the cause of their own inequity or oppression. Settler colonialism is the cause of that. Therefore, we must understand how settler colonialism operates in order to address it and combat its impacts. So this system of power and our own complicity in it can be challenging to see, especially for those of us like me who benefit from it and have been miseducated in a colonial education system. If you think about the basic form of colonialism, that might be described as going to a place, setting up a colony, typically for the purpose of resource extraction from the land. Settler colonization is the form of colonialism here in Canada and many, many other parts of the planet. This is when the folks who settle remain indefinitely. And there's also an active replacement of the Indigenous peoples and a huge disruption to their relationships to the land. So this is very much active in Canada every single day. Settler colonialism may have began here hundreds of years ago, but Canada exists as a settler colonial state, continuing to displace and oppress Indigenous peoples so that we can continue to exploit their land and resources. Arthur Manuel, he's a Wet'muk and Tunaha from the Neskonlith First Nation in so-called British Columbia, describes 3 pillars of settler colonialism that keep it functioning. And these are up on the screen here: dispossession, dependency, and oppression. These are the ongoing power dynamics that are embedded and enforced through things like legislation, policy, and practice, of course. First, the colonial state dispossesses Indigenous peoples of their land, of their cultures, and their identities. Next, they create a dependency on the colonial state for survival, which is also enforced through colonial and systemic violence. And third, Indigenous peoples are kept in a state of subordination or ongoing oppression so that Canadians can continue to occupy and exploit Indigenous land. We're going to go through just a teensy bit of colonial history to explain some of these some more. So in order to understand Indigenous homelessness, we really need to look at how and when that first started. So I want to invite you to think back to Brad describing the concept of all of our relations, right? The belief that everything in creation is alive and interconnected. Land is not thought of as owned, right? In the same way that a Western European idea of ownership would be. Western European ideas of ownership actually require disconnection. It requires that something be separate and outside of ourselves so that we can control it, dominate it, and own it, right? Rather, most Indigenous peoples might say that it is actually the other way around. We are of the land, or we belong to the land, right? And the land is absolutely everything. So it's providing food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and medicine, spirituality, and a sense of belonging. Ultimately, we're saying the land is home for Indigenous peoples. So this means as soon as contact happens, as soon as any displacement from land starts to happen, we're seeing the beginning here of Indigenous homelessness. Since contact, Indigenous peoples have experienced ever more land dispossession and displacement. As Europeans began to build settlements and fight each other to claim the lands in Turtle Island for themselves, Indigenous nations no longer had access to many parts of their homelands, including hunting grounds, maple groves, sacred ceremonial sites, or waterways. Since then, land development and resource extraction in the name of colonial capitalism continue to destroy and interrupt these ecosystems and Indigenous food and sustenance systems, even at this very moment. Few people might know that the largest method of land dispossession actually happened through the treaties that were made, right? Called land surrender treaties. When I first learned that, I was blown away. But to understand this, it's essential to both understand the colonial paradigm of the time, which was shaped by Christian religious authority through the doctrine of discovery. Basically that if land is not owned by a Christian man, then it is nobody's land, terra nullius, and it's ours for the taking. We also have to understand the Royal Proclamation. We're just like skipping right through like lots of hundreds of years of history, even in these 2 sentences here, but we also need to understand the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So this Royal Proclamation remains a relevant and foundational document in the relationship between Indigenous nations and the Crown. Even today, still used, right? It was issued by King George III of Great Britain following the 7 Years' War and British victory over the French. In addition to declaring the British ownership of established European colonies in North America, the Royal Proclamation confirms and enshrines Indigenous land title and rights. So you can see on the map there on the screen, everything east are the established European colonies. Everything west of that proclamation line is confirmed in the Royal Proclamation to be Indigenous land that will be protected from settlement. All of those rights are enshrined in this Royal Proclamation. However, the proclamation was actually the British Empire's response to what has been referred to by colonizers over many years as the Indian problem, i.e., what can we do to erase the Indigenous habitants of the lands that we are colonizing and conquering? Just to put it succinctly like that. I also wanted to just point out and remind everybody that to refer to First Nations, Inuit, Métis people as Indian is absolutely offensive, negative, inaccurate, and not to do that. However, we will, that word it does come up in our presentation. It continues to be the word that is used to describe who is Indigenous and not, even by the federal government today. So I just want to make sure I mention that as well. But here with the Royal Proclamation, it actually strategically lays out a set of criteria for land surrender treaties with Indigenous nations in order for settlers to be able to continue to amass land and resources for the Crown. So it basically establishes Indigenous land title, confirms it, only so that it can be taken away systematically through these treaties. All right. I should also mention that, we are going through this history of colonization. It's really violent, painful information. And like Brad mentioned, we're not able to fully do these things justice today, but we want to put them within the context of Indigenous homelessness and understand all of the hundreds and hundreds of layers of displacement that has happened for Indigenous nations and peoples. So we were talking there about some land dispossession and displacement as people are being displaced from their homelands. Here on this slide, we're talking more specifically about Confederation and the Indian Act policies. So just take care of yourselves as we go through this information together. It can be hard to hear. especially if you haven't heard it, or even if you have heard it before. It's awful stuff. So, Confederation, following initial land dispossession and mass displacement through treaties and violence, things actually get even worse for Indigenous peoples at the founding of Canada here. There's absolutely no conversation or consultation with Indigenous nations whatsoever. So they create, in the British North America Act, now called the Constitution Act, that legitimizes Canada as a separate entity from the British Crown, British Empire. There's one single line in there that states Canada is responsible for Indians and for Indian land. That's the whole extent to which Indigenous nations are included in the founding of Canada. And then just 9 years later, in 1876, they released the Indian Act, which is a piece of legislation that controls all aspects of life for First Nations people, including who is and isn't Indigenous. So through the creation of like Indian status, that strips people of their unique cultural identities and nationhood. They also create the reserve system through this. And these reserves are isolated pieces of land that were set aside for First Nations who were told, this is where you have to go and live now. So out of the entire landmass of Canada, try and guess how much was actually reserved or set aside for First Nations. The answer is 0.2%. So 0.2% of the landmass of Canada is reserved for Indigenous nations. On these reserves, there was an Indian agent, a government official who lived there to enforce the Indian Act policies. And until 1951, you needed a pass from him to come and go from the reserve. Indigenous peoples are isolated. Their movement is restricted and controlled, rendering them unable to gather or hunt for food, material for shelter, or for clothing. They're actually made to be completely dependent on the colonial state for housing, healthcare, and sustenance through the provision of weekly rations. Sometimes these are referred to as the 5 deadly whites or the 5 white gifts: flour, sugar, lard, salt, and even alcohol, which was later replaced with dairy. The Indian Act and other Indian affairs policies dispossess people of their land and identities, create a dependency on the state for survival, and perpetuate ongoing oppression that strips Indigenous peoples of their autonomy and sovereignty. Indigenous peoples have always known, and still today know, how to take care of themselves, cope, and heal using their cultural practices and ceremonies. The government knew this, and they legislated the dispossession of Indigenous spirituality and health practices by actually criminalizing Indigenous culture, ceremonies, and healing practices. So things like smudging, sweat lodge, Debwewin lodge, longhouse, Sundance, and a lot more. All of these were illegal, and Indigenous peoples were imprisoned, and even worse if they were caught doing them. There was even a 3-year period where it was illegal for an Indigenous person to dance in order to dispossess them of their joy. And you can even take the time to Google that letter from Duncan Campbell Scott there. He said, "We notice that these Indigenous people are being too joyful. This is not conducive to our colonial mission, so it's illegal for them to dance now." Just wild, disgusting things like that. This kind of legislation also creates a reliance on Western European health practices for their wellness, as Indigenous people are unable to access their traditional medicines or engage in these healing ceremonies. So the federal government and Christian churches targeted Indigenous families and children also through residential schools and Indian day schools, making it mandatory for First Nations children to attend, often far away from their families and communities. Children were abused physically, sexually, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Canada's Food Guide was originally created based on experiments they did at residential schools by starving Indigenous children. Children died preventable, often violent deaths, and they were buried in unmarked graves. In the 60s scoop, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were taken from their families and placed with non-Indigenous families as another attempt at Indigenous erasure, and under the racist guise that Indigenous parents were unable to properly care for their children. Today, over half of the children in foster care under the age of 14 are Indigenous, despite only making up 8% of that age demographic in Canada. All of these colonial policies and violence has resulted in complex colonial and intergenerational trauma for Indigenous individuals, families, and communities. And these are absolutely not events relegated to the past. For anytime you hear that happened so long ago, people should get over it. Just need to really tell that person to shut up, right? People my age attended day school. People my age and younger's parents and grandparents survived residential school where they learned absolutely nothing but trauma and abuse. So most, if not all, of my Indigenous coworkers, people I love, the people we support in our work, are affected in one way or another. Some whose parents were scooped and they are reconnecting with their indigeneity, others who survived day school and are working to break cycles of intergenerational trauma. So we also say that care for Indigenous people can't actually be culturally safe if it is not trauma informed, or in this case, colonial trauma informed. So through target, like hopefully you can see from all of these, just packed a lot into that slide here of Indian Act policies through targeting indigeneity, culture, ceremony, through targeting children and families. The Canadian government has created even deeper types of dislocation where people are deprived of their very cultures, their languages, deprived of their very identity as to who they are. So that's the deeper layers of Indigenous homelessness: separation from land, separation from relationship, to even knowing who am I? Who am I? This actually has, of course, always been and still remains the intention and purpose of Canada's government, which is predicated on the erasure of Indigenous peoples. Here is a quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, this guy again, on the slide. "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." This is just one example that, you can just look at very clearly. This has always been the intention of the government. While this objective has obviously failed so far, settler colonialism is active and ongoing across Canadian occupied territories, where Indigenous peoples continue to experience dispossession, dependency, and oppression every single day through the persistent denial of their sovereignty, the continued theft of their land and resources, the over-policing and over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples, the imposition of a colonial governance system on reserves, and much more. Cut off from traditional Indigenous ways of being, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people are dependent on the very state that has conspired to steal their land and take their children, as they're required to navigate colonial systems such as the housing system, the justice system, the healthcare system, and so on. As a result of all of this, Indigenous peoples live in a state of ongoing oppression that more often than not deprives them of their health and wellness, as well as deprives them as a sense of home and belonging.
The concept of systemic or structural racism means that the way a system is designed disadvantages a group of people based on their racialized identity. Today, we see many ways in which colonialism and structural racism create barriers for Indigenous peoples to live a high quality of life. Colonialism is embedded in legislation and within our different systems like education, justice, housing, economy, and so on. The reserve system is still in place, and most communities are located far from the city or can be very isolated, such as in Northern Ontario, where they're only fly-in communities. This isolation, in addition to the chronic underfunding of services on reserve, creates barriers of addressing social services, housing, education, and even clean drinking water. For Indigenous youth, systemic barriers and disadvantages exist from birth when you're born on a reserve. Under settler colonialism, all of the resources we can access are foreign to us. Like Cass mentioned, to gain any supports, we have to navigate colonial institutions like education, justice systems, housing systems, healthcare systems, and so on. These systems have built-in biases towards European cultures, such as requiring paperwork, needing ID, treating everyone the same, needing money, meeting deadlines, being on time, etc. That can all be systemic barriers for Indigenous peoples. Community-based research also speaks to a lack of cultural safety and understanding of colonial trauma among service providers, which increases the barriers for Indigenous peoples to access the supports they need. Often, Indigenous people will choose not to access services at all due to a lack of trust or past experiences of racism and discrimination. From all this historical and ongoing colonization, we know that Indigenous peoples have experienced intense amounts of psychological trauma and profound grief and loss. As human beings, there's only so much we can deal with. And we have natural coping mechanisms for trauma. Some coping mechanisms have been labeled maladaptive, meaning they are not helping us live our best lives, but from everything we're learning today. It becomes easier to understand these coping mechanisms as reasonable and expected responses to horrific situations. As Indigenous peoples, we're doing the best we can to cope with intense amounts of psychological and intergenerational trauma. It is extremely important to take a trauma-informed approach with Indigenous participants and notice and address the hidden stereotypes or biases we might have of Indigenous peoples. As helpers, we must understand behaviors we might encounter our natural ways of coping with this colonial trauma, and the person in front of you needs support, compassion, and kindness. Moving now into an overview of the 12 dimensions of Indigenous homelessness. If you have these handy from the pre-reading, it'll be helpful if you can pull those out now, or we'll have them in the chat if we can, or a link to them. These come from the Indigenous peoples across Canada and were gathered through Jesse Thistle's research as the 12 most common types or manifestations of Indigenous homelessness. They can be layered or overlapping, meaning they may be happening simultaneously, or they can apply at different points in someone's life based on changing circumstances. These dimensions are meant to be a map or a description of someone's complex experiences, not clear-cut black and white categories. Number one is historic displacement. Describes Indigenous communities and nations made historically homeless after being displaced from pre-colonial Indigenous lands. Number two, contemporary geographic separation. Indigenous individuals and communities separated from Indigenous lands after colonial control. Three, spiritual disconnection is when Indigenous individuals and communities are separated from Indigenous worldviews or connection to the creator or equivalent deity. Four, mental disruption and imbalance is an imbalance of mental faculties experienced by Indigenous individuals and communities that is caused by colonization's entrenched social and economic marginalization of Indigenous peoples. Five, cultural disintegration and loss is a type of homelessness that dislocates or alienates Indigenous individuals and communities from their culture and relationship networks known as all of my relations. Six, overcrowding is when the number of people per dwelling in urban and rural Indigenous households exceeds the national Canadian household average, thus contributing to and creating unsafe, unhealthy living spaces. Number seven, relocation and mobility refers to Indigenous individuals traveling over geographic distances between urban and rural spaces for access to work, health, education, recreation, social services, spiritual events and ceremonies, to see family and friends, and to access affordable housing. Number eight, going home is a kind of homelessness experienced by Indigenous individuals and families who have lived outside their community for a long period of time, and upon returning home are often seen as outsiders, making it difficult to secure housing due to bureaucratic barriers, lateral violence, and cultural dislocation. Number nine, nowhere to go is a complete lack of access to stable shelter, housing, accommodation, shelter services, or relationships, literally having nowhere to go. Number 10, escaping or evading harm. Indigenous persons fleeing unstable, unsafe, unhealthy households to obtain a measure of safety to survive. Young people, women, and LGBTQ2S+ people are particularly vulnerable. 11, emergency crisis. Natural disasters, large-scale environmental manipulation, and acts of human mischief, along with bureaucratic red tape, combining to cause Indigenous peoples to leave their homes because systems are not ready or willing to cope with an immediate demand for housing. 12, climate refugee. Indigenous peoples and communities whose lifestyle, subsistence patterns, and food sources, relationships to animals, connection to land and water have been greatly altered by drastic and cumulative weather shifts due to climate change. If you want to keep those handy, the 12 dimensions, we're going to take a look at some of these dimensions with regard to residential schools. Though arguably all of the dimensions can apply to residential schools, we have pulled a few of the top ones here, such as number 2, contemporary geographic separation. Under the Indian Act, it was mandatory for First Nations children to attend residential schools. Many children were sent far away from their families and communities, even if there was a closer option. Many from Northern Ontario were sent south, and one of our staff from Oneida nearby here shared that her grandmother was sent to residential school in Manitoba. This was done to prevent runaways and cause as much separation as possible. Also, 3, spiritual disconnection. Culture and spirituality is embedded in who we are as Indigenous people. Generations upon generations were born into communities of our people who lived a cultural and spiritual way of life every day. As a result, children were born into a strong, healthy, dignified sense of identity, community, and belonging. The impact of residential schools put a deep fracture into this way of life, causing a spiritual disconnection within and amongst Indigenous peoples. However, our way of life was never completely gone. There were many who had to practice it in secret to keep it alive for future generations. And mental disruption and balance also. Residential schools completely disrupted the mental health of the students who attended. Loss of languages, identity, support systems, kinship, community, and connection to land are just some of the ways their life balance was affected. Substitute that with abuse in all forms and many forms, a foreign language, foreign spirituality, and an enforced different approach to daily life, and you can see how the residential schools impacted every facet of their lives. Cultural disintegration and loss. Here you can see how closely these 3 dimensions are related, having somewhat of a cause and effect relationship. If someone has experienced one of these, they are likely to experience another as well. In residential schools, Indigenous languages and spiritual and cultural practices were strictly forbidden, and children were violently punished if they were caught doing any of them. The horrific physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual abuse at the schools centered on forcefully removing the Indian from the child. By teaching that to be Indigenous was to be inferior and uncivilized, children were told that they were stupid, savage, sinners, dirty, and so on. Can you imagine the toll this would take on a child's mental development? Residential schools trauma has resulted in cycles of depression, anxiety, isolation, self-hatred, leading to self-harm and suicide, dissociation, substance disorder, and a whole lot more. Going home. Attending a residential school made it difficult to return to your home community if you wanted to do so. Under colonialism, reserves were made to be impoverished and not ideal for living. Most communities face housing shortages even today, so they're physically not a place for you and your community, but there were social barriers as well. Imagine being away for years and not knowing your language, feeling like an outsider, not feeling part of the community any longer, or feeling like the community no longer wants you. Escaping and abating harm. The intergenerational trauma from residential schools has contributed to unsafe living conditions for youth even today. Children who attended residential school learned nothing but trauma and abuse. They did not receive hugs or unconditional love. They did not learn how to parent or even be a part of a family. Even today, some of the youth we support have left home very young to get away from other family members who are stuck in cycles of violence and substance use resulting from residential school trauma.
Yeah, that's a big one. Our staff talk about and our participants talk about that a lot, the number 10. So as service providers, to be aware of these impacts on the people that you're supporting, they're definitely ongoing. We also have another case scenario to look at together here. Usually we would kind of do these in breakout groups, but we pulled this one out. It's a really common experience. It speaks to some common experiences of some of the Indigenous participants we support here. So an 18-year-old Indigenous youth, Stanley, moved to Toronto from a remote Northern First Nation community with hopes of finding employment. Approximately 1,200 individuals from his community attended residential schools, including Stanley's father and grandparents. Stanley was placed in foster care for several years. To cope with living on the street and the trauma he's experienced, Stanley uses substances daily. Under certain circumstances, he displays disruptive behaviors with service providers to have his needs met. He's banned from most shelters in Toronto and has nowhere to go. So you can hopefully have those 12 dimensions handy to look at them as well. The number 4, as Brad was speaking about the mental disruption and imbalance. Even number 10 from the previous slide might also apply here, given the legacy of residential schools that this scenario is sharing with us here. He's using substances and acting out to have his needs met, which speaks to the impact of trauma on Stanley's mental well-being. And we might even consider that his home life may have been influenced by intergenerational trauma, which contributed to his decision to have to leave home. Of course, also, so these dimensions really do overlap with one another. Hard to separate sometimes. So this leads into number 7, relocation and mobility, why he has to leave home. He has to move far away from his community to find employment. This is pretty common with folks we might be supporting in the city, and like all cities, right? People have to leave their home communities to access services, to find a job, even and just to survive the best that they can. So they become disconnected from their communities and families back in their home community. Even our own staff here at Atlohsa who work here in the city, the closest, it's called the Tri-Res area, someone said recently. I was like, I never heard that. Chippewa, Muncie, Oneida, it's about 30 kilometers away from London, are driving every day here and back. And we had one staff who drove here from Giwetashkad. It's like Walpole Island First Nation, about almost 2-hour drive here, 2-hour drive home, who did that for over a year while she was trying to find housing in London. Yeah, it's important to consider the toll that all of this travel, disconnection may take on someone's mental state and their holistic wellness. And yeah, Stanley teaches us so much. He's based off of one of our beloved participants I always think of when we pull up this case scenario, who actually passed away in his mid-20s because of the life that he lived, but he continues to teach us things every single day. So thank you to Stanley. It's not his real name, of course, but grateful. I hope everyone here also picked up on number 9, right? With the way that led off, banned from most shelters in Toronto, and he has absolutely nowhere to go. This one's absolutely huge for Stanley and for many of the folks we support at Atlohsa. Often when folks come to us, they have been banned from everywhere else in the city. We constantly see the harm of service restrictions and bans that cut participants off from their supports and everything that they need to get by and just survive. Stanley here is now experiencing the same cycle of displacement as his ancestors, having nowhere to go and completely disconnected from any relationships or any supports. We know that bans are a matter of life and death because we see it over and over again. So many stories, heartbreaking stories. A 17-year-old is banned from the only youth shelter in the city and dies a week later, having been victimized in the adult system. Another banned from shelter and died a month later on the street. Not only is someone less likely to return to service if a ban is lifted, they are extremely vulnerable. They're at higher risk for overdose if they are using alone. They're more vulnerable for being exploited or trafficked. Think murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people. And for Indigenous peoples, they might be at higher risk for being picked up by the police. So this is absolutely an urgent safety risk for Indigenous folks because they're known to be abused in the justice system and treated really horribly by police. If you don't know like what a starlight tour is, you should probably look that up. But there's a lot of abuses that happen to Indigenous folks in the justice system. All of this to say that service bans are extremely harmful and we advocate strongly against them. We understand that it is not easy work, but these are essential considerations we have to take into account when making these kinds of decisions as service providers, as we have that power imbalance, right? We have the power that are we further dislocating, further displacing somebody by placing a ban on them? We'll probably, no, not probably, we will definitely be going probably deeper into service restrictions and what this looks like for Indigenous folks in the next part 2 of Bimadzwin. So we hope that you can see what an absolute gift these 12 dimensions of Indigenous homelessness are for us as service providers. It's a case management tool that you can use to help analyze the factors and barriers preventing housing and new solutions to pursue. Understanding these may allow you to hear, listen, and understand someone's story on a deeper level. You may help your participants feel seen and heard because these give you the language to be able to speak about these things a little bit better. And we've done that. We've shared this information with groups of Indigenous youth. All of our staff take our training and learn this information as well. And we hear from folks saying, like, I've felt these things before, I've experienced them, but I've never been able to name it. I've never been able to talk about it. So it's really a gift to have this language to be able to talk about them. It can be extremely validating for folks and help to change the default narrative someone may have of themselves. And these can also change the narrative or bias that we might be having about a person who we're supporting. It's actually not that they aren't trying hard enough or that they don't care. It's that they have experienced trauma and they're facing some pretty immense systemic barriers. Whether you support Indigenous participants directly or indirectly, this is also an awesome advocacy tool that you can use. We use them here even to plan different kinds of programs for Indigenous folks. Right, here's 12 things that have been taken away that we can work to reconnect folks back to. I've heard one of our managers say that. Keep these handy in your work. It's kind of, I think we made it on time, you guys. That's what. Um, Yeah, so that's what we have to share with you for today. But we have an education website. It's called Truth Before Reconciliation. It goes deeper into a lot of the things that I had mentioned on the slide to understand more about settler colonialism and how that operates here in what's called Canada. And then we do offer Giwetashkad training modules in the London region. You can scan this QR code to learn more. I'll take you to our website there. You can also follow Atlohsa online on the socials there. Are we too early?
No, not at all. And I
Okay.
think too, like, thank you so much, Cassandra and Bradley.
Mm.
Um, and I appreciate you starting with saying that, like, 45 minutes to talk about 500 years of history. And so you're right, we're not going to give it the full justice that it deserves. And I think part of when we were preparing for today was saying today is really about, as is for a lot of our webinars, planting a seed around a particular topic to give some introduction to some themes that if you can, and some leads on ways to expand your learning after leaving here today. So raising that awareness, planting that seed so that you can be a farmer and further grow that knowledge leaving today's webinar. And I appreciate you sharing the information at the end there around how folks can connect with you, especially if they're in the London region, to do some further training uh, with the both of you. And I know I know that this isn't how typically you deliver training, so I appreciate the flexibility to do it in this way, so that we can have your words shared with folks across a greater area than just the London region. So I really appreciate that you having that flexibility to present stuff in that way for us today. We are going to move into the Q&A portion of today's webinar. So really what I would encourage folks is, if you didn't hear me earlier and you accidentally put your question in the chat, to please just repost your question into the Q&A box so I can find it more easily there. And we'll be happy to start answering those questions. Maybe what I can do to kind of help get the ball rolling is start with my own question to the both of you. When you were speaking, I was thinking about how much some of these concepts align with what we're trying to achieve at CSTN in trying to support a housing-focused approach, because some of the core pieces of a housing-focused approach is adopting a trauma-informed and person-centered engagement with people for our shelters, and intentionally avoiding ever re-traumatizing people accessing our shelters. So when you were talking about residential schools, you mentioned kind of the impact of spiritual disconnection and cultural disintegration, which I think as shelter operators, we could potentially be unintentionally doing that if we're not finding ways to think about more trauma-informed practices and specific to potentially our Indigenous shelter guests who reside in the shelter for whatever period of time. So I guess that's my question. My first question is, how can really emergency shelter operators support in with Indigenous guests, like reconnecting with identity and culture and community while also trying to kind of meet their immediate needs of safety and housing?
Want to go take it, Brad?
I got a really good answer for that. Take it away, Cass.
Oh my gosh, come on.
Uh, I mean, that is quite a loaded question. So when you're talking about residential schools, you're talking about generations of families, generations of people, totally disconnected from who they are and their identity. And there's a lot who have, adopted the Catholic way of life, Christian way of life, the Bible and stuff like that because of residential schools. And so I guess talk with somebody and finding their identity. And Cass, you could probably answer more to this. I can. When you connect with somebody, kind of ask where they're from, where their nation is from, and then see if you can connect with people in their home community where they're from, or their family or their other community members, and see if you can, as a worker, be that middle person to helping them find those supports and advocate on their behalf, and be that. For in my previous housing experience, I had to literally like hold people's hand to take them someplace to go. And if I didn't do that, there was no way they were going to be able to access that support or even get that kind of respect from another non-indigenous worker just because they're indigenous, because of the historical attitude towards indigenous people. It is still alive today. And I'll share just a small sample of that. When I first moved to Ontario, I was walking I was working at a indigenous organization, and somebody's walking by. It was a non-indigenous lady. And I said, good morning. And I waved at her, and she looked at me and she shook her head. And she's like, don't say good morning to me, you traitors of Canada. And I don't know this person. I never met them. There was no formal introduction, anything. It was just a passerby. And to me, that was just, okay, it's still alive. This racism, this discrimination is still alive. And that's the immediate assumption somebody has towards me just because I'm indigenous. So, I mean, yeah, advocacy is powerful in the line of work that we do.
Mm,
Reaching out and finding the support because sometimes some people don't even know where to start. I heard this thing saying there's no starting point on a circle. You just jump on and you start. And so you start with somebody where they're at, and then help them reach out and find the supports in their area. And some people aren't even, because of 60 Scoop as well, they aren't even familiar with their family history, their direct family, and the community, and all this stuff. So that's my little take on that. I mean, there's more to it. It's a loaded question, and some people are more educated and aware and of resources and more culturally connected than I am. And that's my kind of my offer in that little part. But feel free, Cass, if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I can expand on some. I think what you're referring to is like building good relationships. That'll probably be my answer to all the questions. Right? Is everything being rooted in the relationships that you have, both with your participants, but as shelter workers, as shelter leaders. What Indigenous peoples like in your area do you have relationships with? Can you invite an elder to come and be present in case somebody in your shelter would like to speak with them, right? And learn something, have a conversation, learn more about who they are. Can be something simple as what do you have a policy on smudging? Do you have those medicines available to people that might want them? Do your workers know how to use that or what that means to somebody? Yeah, that's just a really simple one, I think. Often we've been to places where it's like, oh, the smoke alarms will go off. We can't have smudging, but that's like just not true. It's not a lot of smoke that is created to do that, and it's a really important practice. As we saw here, you know, that was outlawed for over 75 years. It's really important for Indigenous folks to be able to reclaim some of those things and for them to be legitimized by everybody as legitimate practices. those are some of my thoughts on that. And of course, I also wanted to say that those things should be Indigenous led. So always reconnecting back to community, to elders, to people that know those teachings in whatever area you are in. Those kinds of reconnecting back to culture, ceremony, anything like that should all be Indigenous led.
Mhm. Well, and I appreciate you mentioned that, and also this piece around, you mentioned that it's, some of these things that you mentioned, you stated are simple, but I would say that they're simple, but they're quite impactful because, especially for someone coming into a space, it, like you said, it legitimizes maybe practices that once upon a time and often, unfortunately, still currently have been delegitimized. So
Mhm.
hearing from Indigenous guests who have gone into shelter spaces before, where even just simple things like being greeted um, in their language, or their language reflected in the signage around a shelter space, or representation amongst staff and volunteers in the space. I like that you mentioned this piece around engagement with elders in the area to have some presence and ability to connect with your shelter guests. I think um, but like you said, like you have to, I think folks will, like to Brad's point, is saying like people say, well, I don't know where to start. And I appreciate the circle, like you just have to jump on somewhere and start doing it. Um, I know I'll pass it over to the questions that are going to be coming in in the Q&A next, but really I really wanted to, before I lose it out of my brain, is this piece that you mentioned, and I'm glad that you spent time on it, was within one of the dimensions, is that piece around nowhere to go. And so oftentimes shelter operators really struggle with this idea of wanting to be really low barrier and minimizing any service restrictions, because they know that there are negative impacts where people potentially have nowhere to go after that shelter, because it's kind of a last resort situation. And we also, as you mentioned, Indigenous people are disproportionately negatively impacted by service barring, right? When they by police, by other institutions. So I guess I'm wondering, maybe drawing on even from your own organizations, especially with the relationship to the Wigwamanon shelter in London, what are maybe some like takeaways that we could share from your own learning at Wigwamanon around like how you support someone to be able to continue to access your service while still honoring and addressing safety concerns that maybe like historically would have led to barring that you're now avoiding?
Dominica?
Yeah, I think I might have more experience about that with I thought of the instance that we had a couple of years ago with somebody the TP outside.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So again, it's all about relationship. It's all about the relationship you have with that person. Um, a few things came to mind as you were asking that, like what is needed, like staff training is essential and important, that staff feel capable and they understand the impacts that service restrictions might have on a person. I remember even when I worked there, I had um I was afraid. I became fearful of a participant, and I was scared, and I called my manager and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think this person can come back here. Because they eventually did leave site, but it spoke to like trauma informed supervision and my manager's ability to have an important conversation with me about what my safety looks like, what that person's safety looks like, and is there a way that we can work together? And he did come back, and that's awesome. There's probably more to that story, but I think staff training is essential, like working as a team and having individualized care plans to truly meet people where they're at. So we're going to talk more about that as well in the next part. But what Brad was referring to here was a case where um, there's a person with higher needs that some staff were feeling like, oh, I don't think we can support him anymore here. And other staff knew that to restrict this person would be a matter of life and death. Like they've seen it so many times before, where some more of the seasoned staff that if we were to ban this person, that they would probably, like, it's very likely they would have died soon after that. So the whole team came together to create and worked with him as well. What do you need when you're having an outburst? If you're yelling, what do you need from us in that time? And he just said, I need to scream. I need to let it out. I need to get out of my body. So they actually put up a second little teepee outside of the shelter at Weeguamanon. They rolled a cot in there, and that was his little safe space that he could still be safe and close, but he wasn't inside the building anymore, disrupting anything going on in there. And it was just a space he could have his needs met. And they found out a few things while he was in there. They found out that he's diabetic, which they didn't know before, and that his blood sugars were really contributing to some of the behaviors that they were seeing. So they were able to start treating that. But again, I think it comes back down to the relationship piece. I think he was like, holy, these people just put up a little place for me. Like, they're not going to abandon me, actually. Maybe I can work with them. Maybe I can. And eventually he did move back inside, and he's housed now. So it's like just an awesome story. There's probably more going on there, but that's a quick rundown of what happened in that case. But as we'll talk about too, applying the same exact rules to every single person is actually oppressive in a colonial sense, because not everybody's starting from the same place. It's another way that I think the system of colonialism's hidden within like rules and regulations is by creating this myth of like equality. We're going to treat everyone the same. Well, not everybody is the same. So it's hard work, but working individually with the people based on their needs goes a far way. It saves lives. I've seen it happen. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, and that's a really powerful example that you shared, because I think it highlighted a few key things. One was that there was an openness to modify the support as opposed to restrict it. You were able to create an opportunity between staff and the shelter guests to hear directly from the shelter guests around what they need in order to be successful in that space, and then being able to deliver on an individualized approach based on what they shared about what they need to make it work. And then it ultimately created a different outcome than if you were to just have barred them and then ended the relationship and the opportunity to create a different outcome. So I think that's a great example. And it sounds like it was a modification that still respected the safety of staff and other guests, but worked for that individual.
Mhm.
That's great.
Okay.
We have some questions rolling in here. So first one here is, do you have a recommendation for a good training for group debriefing for frontline staff when managing crisis?
I do not. I can
Okay.
only speak to um, a crisis that I had been a part of, um, finding somebody that had passed away in the shelter. And I was immediately, it's more of a policy, maybe not a training, but more of a practice that immediately it was on the weekend. I called a manager, and they came right in. Like, we had leadership, we had a cultural support worker that came right in, and he had a circle right there for that support immediately with both the participants that were in the shelter at the time, because they were, witnessing what was happening as well as the workers that were there. So immediately pulled into a circle to be able to debrief. And yeah, that's the only thought that kind of came to mind about that.
I see we have also a director from Atlohsa, Andrea, hopping in the chat saying that Atlohsa staff here, we have taken group debriefing training through CTRI, so that could be an option that shelters can look at. But what I'm hearing from you, Cassandra, is like the importance of some type of policy or practice that clearly outlines how staff can have the opportunity to feel supported through a critical like incident debriefing
Mhm.
exercise or a process. The other thing that I would encourage too, if it's not about post-incident after a crisis, but even if you want to think about like managing crisis in the moment while it's happening, I know that please take a look at a previous webinar that we did specifically that was led by OrgCode about trauma-informed de-escalation for crisis situations in low barrier shelters. But I think what, you know, whoever asked this question too, if you're looking for any type of specific resources or policies and procedures or practices that shelters can look at for group debriefing after a crisis, please email me directly through the CSTN website, and I'm happy to try to link you to folks within the network who have some experience in this area. And then potentially also, it sounds like Andrea from Atlohsa might be a good connection for some insights around that. So thanks, Andrea, for sharing that in the chat as well. Okay, the other is that we have a question here that says, how do you start that conversation with a person who is not willing to engage? And I might even just add a little bit to that of saying, like, I'm going to guess based on my own experience, but probably yours and what you shared today, is that uh, there's a lot of mistrust, and a lot of mistrust that comes from a very legitimate place based on how people have been treated or impacted, potentially even by shelters from previous experiences when accidents. So like, how do we rebuild? What are some things that you've seen that have been effective with frontline staff around rebuilding those relationships and increasing the willingness of engagement from people who are accessing your shelter?
Brad, I can.
Let me see here. So I think one thing that comes to mind for me, and it kind of boils down to the human to human kind of connection. And I remember Wendy Hill sharing with me one time, she's a Cayuga traditional healer, and she was talking about professionalism. She's saying people use this word professionalism, and she said all it boils down to is um, being respectful to the person sitting in the chair across from you. And I think coming from that kind of standpoint approach of looking at somebody and who's coming to you for help. And I remember a youth participant sharing with me at a training one time saying that, Matt, we're going through all the worst things going on in our life. Nothing is working for us. We have no support. Today is the worst day of my life, and I'm coming to you for help. You know, understanding that undertaking we take on as a helper, people are relying on us and depending on us for kind of guidance in life and how to self-care and how to practice those things and how to learn how to practice those self-compassionate thoughts. And I think patience is a big part of the journey as well when working with people and meeting them where they're at. And little sometimes bite-sized pieces, little steps, baby steps here and there, but at least steps are being taken. And it's easier said than done, what I'm saying right now. You know, it's doing that hard nitty-gritty work is 24/7, and there's crisis moments, and there's moments of growth, there's moments of self-care, moments of well-being, and there's moments of emergency situations where support is needed at all levels of within themselves. So yeah, I would say patience. That's my there's a lot of seasoned veterans in this line of work who have these beautiful tidbits of knowledge of how to connect with somebody and help them feel safe and feel that I can trust you. You know, sometimes it might take a couple of sessions, couple encounters, and then they'll realize that, okay, this person keeps their word. This person is there to help me. This person has a good heart. I can see that they're in this line of work and they want me to get better. And so it's like a case plan, care plan with people, understanding every slowly but surely they'll realize that you're there to help them in any ways possible. And that's the beauty of being a helper. You know, that's the hard part about being a helper as well, is you're helping to take care of a fellow human being. As Indigenous people too, you know, there's resistance to authority, a resistance to police, to workers, to people in these kind of power dynamic situations because of that, you know, and maybe they don't even realize that that's where it's stemming from. And because of the upbringing, you learn behaviors and you learn this and you see that, and safety and love and kinship and looking at somebody as a relative and that you want them to get better. I think hopefully that helps. You know, that's my take on it. I've been a housing worker, I've been a shelter worker, I've been in transitional housing, and case manager, outreach, and all these things, and understand like you just never know where somebody's at when they're coming to us for help, and it's up to us to kind of like break things down sometimes. And motivational interviewing is kind of an approach where you get to know somebody and help understand where they're at and how you can help them. People don't know what they don't know, and if you're there to be able to spread some awareness and help them understand this whole vast system that's out there, and there's helpers out there that want to help them. And for me, my approach was always kind of the middle person, like, oh, you need mental health supports, let's health supports. You need food, let's go find food. You need clothing, let's go find clothing. You want to reconnect your identity, well, let's go get your spirit name. Let's go learn how to pray with tobacco. Let's go crawl into the sweat lodge. I'll crawl with you. I had to do that where I took somebody to their first sweat lodge and crawled in sweat lodge with them and helped them see that it wasn't an unsafe place, because they were taught our culture was heathen and not us. And so I helped them connect to their culture, to our culture, and to their spirit name and cultural identity and all this good stuff. So that's my take on it. Hopefully that helps answer that question even just a little bit.
I think that's super helpful, Brad. And if I can build a little bit off of your answer, one is I really appreciate the piece that you mentioned about patience, and that resonates a lot when I think about if we're very intentional about this work is relational, not transactional. And I remember my first social worky job, straight out of university, was working at the Youth Action Center, which is a drop-in center for youth in London, Ontario. And I remember early days wanting to help everybody right away, and everybody, I'm going to be everybody's best friend and super worker with my cape on. And some youth I connected with right away, and others, and most notably, I can think of one in particular, who every time I said hello when they entered the center would tell me to F off. But I recognized that, and through the wisdom of some folks more experienced than me, they said, Grant, like this person is not being service resistant, they're being service selective. Right. And that really resonated with me because I thought about if I just said yes to every person who tried to sell something to me that knocked at my door, I'd end up buying a lot of stuff I didn't need. And maybe we do want people to be a little bit more selective, and I should be the one having to prove myself to build trust over time. Uh, and and so I think about that now when I think about change moves at the pace of trust. So as a worker, as a helper, however you identify, how am I building that trust? And you mentioned some of the strategies, but I think creating ways of routines that show that I'm reliable, that I'm consistent, that I'm supportive, that I make scary things seem less scary or less threatening by directly offering to participate with them through a process, all those things. And I will say that that person every day coming into the center for breakfast every day told me to F off with a smile on their face for 2 years. Because who am I to them? I'm just another person wanting to help out of a long line of other people who said they wanted to help in the past who didn't. And after 2 years, when this person was really in a jam, and here's a guy who shows consistent care even when I'm not nice, even during my worst days when I'm not nice, they came to me for that help because they knew that I was there to provide support, whether they were nice or not, whatever it might be. So just being able to be that open line and create that opportunity, I think requires a lot of patience, but a lot of commitment, and put the work on us as the workers to really kind of prove ourselves to people. Um, I know we have some more questions here. So the other question that came up is, could you please explain a bit more about changing the default narrative, I think was mentioned in the presentation.
Yeah, I think that means people's default narrative about themselves is a pretty negative one.
Mm,
Um, they um their first go-to is like maybe they've been told they don't have value as a human. They don't feel like they have value, and um don't understand why they feel the things they feel, or why they can't just get housed, like why all these things seem to be happening to them, and that it might be their fault. So I think that a lot of folks we support, that is their default narrative about themselves. There might be a default narrative as workers that we carry about people who display what we call like challenging behaviors and things like that, that they're not trying hard enough, that they don't want help, things like that. I think there's just default narratives that exist that are maybe unconscious bias. And I think that's what that meant anyway.
Okay. And so it's kind of our work to really kind of challenge or push back or offer alternative narratives to that default.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Using those 12 dimensions,
Yeah.
um, being able to talk about what might be experiencing or what that person might be experiencing.
Um, I think Brad, you kind of hit on this on your last response, but feel free to add additional pieces to it. Marcy's asking, how do you encourage Indigenous shelter guests to engage or involve themselves with more with their community and heritage? I think you spoke a lot about like directly, like if you're seen as like a trusted person to directly help them by going with them to a lot of stuff and making more of an intentional effort to connect them.
Let me see here. So there's this term I heard, and it resonates with me, and I share it as I go on my journeys. And it's this generational shift that our people are on. That we're coming back to our ceremonies, to our songs, to our culture, to our language, to our ceremonial tools, to help us understand who we are, remember who we are, and come back to who we are. And I always say that. I believe these are the prayers of our ancestors that are coming in and wanting us to remember who we are and carry that on forward with future generations. And we talk about 7 generations kind of perspective and approach to life, to this life that we live, and trying to remember that the things we do, we're trying to do it for the 7 generations down the road. And yeah, so a lot of our people are reconnecting, and you just never know where they're at. And so as we reconnect and as we heal and as we understand who we are, then we can help our fellow people on that journey as well. I remember a saying teaching about there's a tradition here that was saying, if we have this shelf of all these ceremonial tools, hopefully this makes sense. And they're waiting for us to pick them up. We can pick them up at any time. The rattle, the drum, chanupa, pipe, all these different tools that help us connect spiritually. But because of colonization, because of intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, we don't feel worthy of that. We don't feel, or we weren't growing up in that. So we don't connect it. We don't pick those up. They're always waiting for us to pick them up. And so it's always, there's starting points for different people, different times. And that's who we are. And I remember late executive director Joe Hester was saying that these are embedded in who we are as a people. These songs are who we are. And so it's just up to us, taking that journey. It's not easy, because that self-worth that is so deeply ingrained because of this historical trauma, that's the battle. Sometimes 24 hours a day could be a battle for somebody to feel worthy about living that life. But it's all, our way of life is about love, about the 7 grandfather teachings, respect, bravery, honesty, all these good qualities. And even smudging is part of is mental health when you think about it. Well, I went fishing with somebody in Northern Ontario. We're just sitting on the lake and he just points his hand around. He's like, this is our mental health. I was like, what does it mean? Like, and I was trying to be critical about it and be like, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean? There's trees over there. Does it mean there's water droplets? I was like, just our connection to land. And hopefully having that kind of approach rather than sitting in an office sometimes, taking out on the land. I remember somebody teaching me about how to pray with tobacco. They were like, hey, come, we're going to get out of the building, out of the office. Let's go sit by this tree and here, hold this tobacco in your hand. And I'm going to teach you how to pray with tobacco. I think that was my starting point of learning about culture and learning how it can help us grieve in a healthy way. And that's why all I knew was drinking and drugs for grieving and not addressing grieving. And when I started walking down ceremonies and culture, it was like, this is how you can grieve in a healthy way and take care of yourself. Hope that makes sense.
That makes lots of sense, Brad. I appreciate, and I really, as someone who leans heavily and learns heavily from analogies, I really appreciate the reference to the shelf and finding ways to, it's always there, but how do we create comfort in being able to pick up those things from the shelf? One last question, and then I realize we're at the time. I think I know the answer to this, but there's a question saying, do you think the shelter system should have more training frequently for staff on this topic?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And so folks know, right? We are happy to, we're really, really excited to have Brad and Cassandra back next month for part 2 of this series. And who knows, maybe there's more opportunities to keep expanding and introducing more and more of these things, going deeper into the topic through maybe some CSTN webinars in the future. So I want to end, or do you want, I'd love, okay, perfect last slide. Do you want to say your thank yous and goodbyes to the group?
There they are. No, what were you gonna say? I'm
I,
curious to see what you were gonna end with.
I was just going to say thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you to those that attend and participate and take time out of their work day to come and learn together. I really appreciate it, that and the service that you provide every day to folks that we're trying to help back into housing. The work that you do is hard, and so it's really tremendous, and I appreciate you carving out time to join us today. And I want to thank the both of you for carving time out of your day and supporting CSTN and shelter operators across the country. It is very much appreciated. I know I'm walking away with a lot. I'm sure that based on what I can see in the chat and the questions, that folks attending are walking away with a lot. So a big, big thank you to the both of you for your time and your knowledge that you shared with us today.
Thank you.
Any final words from either of you?
Brad?
So my good friend Michael Linklater is from the Saskatoon area. He always shared a quote that resonated with me as one of the greatest gifts you can give somebody is your time. So I'm very thankful to have this opportunity to share the time with you, even if it's virtually. But life is precious, life is short, life is beautiful. And so together we shared this time together and hopefully did some learning. And it was good it was an honor to sit with you all in this way. Padamia miigwech.
So just a reminder, folks, there will be a follow-up email with some stuff from today's session. I'll probably send that out in about a week or so. So thank you again. And then I guess last thing, Brad, Cassandra, do you have time to stay online with me for a few minutes after we say goodbye to everyone?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, everyone, have a wonderful, wonderful day. And we'll see you next month in November for part 2. Bye for now. We'll just give everyone a moment to hop off. Actually, you know what might be easier? Can I just send you both a separate Teams link to meet right now?
Mhm.
Awesome. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. I'll see you in a minute. Bye.
Bye.